The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the first of this webinar series entitled The 3 C's of Cooperative Purchasing: Critical Analysis, Contract Comparison, and Creating a Successful Cooperative Strategy. Sponsored by the National Coalition for Public Procurement, also known as NCPP, this new association seeks to establish and work toward best practices, collaboration efforts, and training for public procurement communities. I'm Tammy Rimes, the former purchasing agent for the City of San Diego, and now serve as a procurement consultant who works with both governments and companies across the country. So into this series, let's think about this. The past decade, most of us in public procurement, it's become an adventure. I often speak at national government conferences, and I'll ask the question, so what's the best part of this job for you? And the answer always seems to have the same theme. The answers range from, I love to solve problems, or there's always something new to learn, to there's never a dull day. Even in my own 24 years of government experience, my purchasing role was probably the most exciting. With that said, let's admit it, our jobs are definitely not all sunshine and roses. Most of us will openly admit that, man, those politics, the changing landscapes, those problem customers, in fact, you could probably see them in your mind right now, and the frustrating situations that can just drive us all a bit crazy. However, many of us can honestly state that we enjoy the work and how purchasing directly contributes to our organization's goals. Our organizations really couldn't do it without us. For example, when that police officer pulls up to a crime scene, who do you think purchased that police vehicle, their flak jacket and safety gear? It was purchasing. When a mom brings their child to enjoy a local city or school playground, who arranged for the landscaping crew to mow the lawns and the janitorial teams to keep the restrooms clean? Yep, that's us. That's purchasing. And even our boards and city councils, who set up those boardrooms with the furniture, computers, and PA systems to host their meetings? You guessed it, purchasing. So let's face it, though, as interesting and varied as our jobs can be, we each buy a lot of the same stuff. As a former purchasing agent, what I purchased for my former City of San Diego, pens, paper, fleet, playground equipment, it's the same stuff that many other cities, counties, school districts, and universities also purchase. And once we put that contract in place, it generally stays in place for about 5 years. And before the expiration date, then we have to go out to bid again, repeating the same process over and over again for all the commodities and services every month of every year. Well, smart procurement folks over the years decide sometimes this could be a poor use of our time. I mean, why should I work on a bid or RFP for months for a simple, well-defined commodity when that work has already been done by someone else with an excellent contract in place? Back when the recession hit, this idea became even more attractive as procurement teams were reduced. The idea of cooperative contracting is a simple one, leveraging a greater volume of spend across a large number of organizations, essentially to drive savings into a contract that can be used and even tailored to any government entity's spending patterns and needs. So it's not a new concept, but it's become very popular over the past few years. Our tough question today for you: do you have a cooperative strategy? Typically, many of us will use one of these co-op contracts in a more reactionary mode. Think of this. The department enters your office. They need something quick because the grant's going to expire. In fact, it's going to expire in 2 weeks. They've had the grant for 2 years, but now quickly purchasing has to pull together a bid and get this awarded in the next 2 weeks. Or who's going to lose the grant? It'll be purchasing, not the department. An emergency occurs. Sometimes even when we're just pressed by time or constraints on the number of personnel to handle our entire workload. Purchasing teams already know about using cooperatives. That's not what we're talking about today. It's time to take it to a higher level as creating a real strategy on your process for cooperative use and implementation. Over the next hour, the information shared will assist you in doing just that. Start the planning for your own roadmap for success. So let's get started. The first of this webinar series, essentially the first C in that long drawn-out title called Critical Analysis. The landscape is changing and growing, and the best way to keep your finger on the pulse is to hear from other managers such as yourself. So as you listen in to the seminar, and we have 3 great panelists today, you can also ask questions as we go along. They will be telling a little bit about their experience at each of their industries, but you also can participate. So let's start. Let's move to the Northeast. One of the advantages we know of using cooperatives is to consolidate spend to drive savings. So one would think if you're the largest city in the nation, specifically the city of New York, with an annual spend of over $2 billion, that you might not necessarily see or need a cooperative. However, let's go ask the man himself. To hear from someone who worked in that procurement chair, we have invited the City of New York's former Chief Acquisition and Reengineering Officer, who also happened to have served as the former CPO for the states of New York and Michigan. Sergio Paneque to kick off this series with his unique perspective. Sergio, welcome to the program and thanks for sharing your insights as a procurement leader.
Oh, thank you so much, Tammy, and NCPP for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Sure. Well, you know, you being the biggest in the nation, you probably have had more experience than any one of us can imagine. So can you share how you came into the procurement world, working with Mayor Bloomberg, who is a very charismatic and innovative leader, and what were some of the initial trials that you faced?
Well, we did quite a bit in Michigan in moving the cooperative angle and strategic sourcing, and I think what we did in Michigan was what Bloomberg wanted to do in the city of New York and transforming public procurement in the city. Although the city was definitely in a position of economically in good, stable hands, Bloomberg and his business background definitely wanted to move and create more value for the taxpayers here. So that's what brought me to New York, and I think the biggest I think that the issues, whether they're large or small, are the same. I think the biggest barriers that I had in trials and bringing into New York was building the trust and the credibility with the agency customers. As you mentioned, the City of New York is a very, very large and complex organization where many of my agency customers were multi-billion-dollar organizations in and of themselves. So building that trust, that credibility, and then instituting strategic sourcing and a partnership was definitely the biggest trial that I needed to confront with New York.
Sure, sure. And customer service was also a huge initiative for your procurement team because your office serves an organization of over 50 departments, and as many, this is mind-boggling to me, you have 300,000 employees across your organization and the agencies. What were some specific customer service challenges for you, and did cooperative contracting come into play?
Well, definitely cooperative contracting was at the core of the solution, especially, you know, coming into a very decentralized sort of environment. You know, again, establishing the trust and the credibility with all of our customers and clients was key. And I believe that the biggest challenge is really building that communication network. And again, I think it's the same whether it's small or large. It's the same. It just needs to be dynamic enough, you know, to facilitate the breadth of the goals that you're really trying to do, and what we were trying to do in New York. Although New York geographically is very dense, that density actually created problems from a communication standpoint. Very difficult to just even go a half a mile up, you know, Manhattan or into the outer boroughs. So communication, whether virtual, whether in writing, and so forth, that network was very, very important to build, you know, going forward to facilitate success. You know, cooperative contracting really, again, going to the trust and the credibility angle that I just spoke about, really provided an instant benefit to my clients. So when I went in and I had those initial meetings with commissioners and their mission program staff, I always asked them, you know, exactly what was it that they needed and what was being unserved in the organization at that point from a procurement standpoint. And invariably, I'd always find that something that they needed was on a cooperative contract. So our willingness to, number one, communicate, and number two, execute upon that need with a new and effective means to fulfilling their mission requirements built that credibility right from the get-go. And even in many cases, we would have a situation where they already had an existing vendor under city contract, but in fact the cooperative provided better value, both service as well as cost and breadth of service, than they had existing. And the fact that we were proactive in that analysis and that deliverable, again, built to that trust and that credibility going forward. Just to give you a quick example of where cooperative contracting helped us really effectuate major change across the environment, our central fleet operations, one of the things that Bloomberg wanted to do was consolidate much of the city's fleet into one organization. Very difficult when you're looking at a 25,000 unit fleet that spans everything from sanitation trucks to heavy environmental equipment and the like. And the way, and some of the things that we were looking at wanting to do was, number one, offer a zip car solution, implement fuel management of the city's fuel depots across the enterprise, implement citywide vehicle management system and the like. And we went to GSA, we went to the state of New York's contracts, we went to other state contracts, City of Chicago contracts, cooperative contracts, and we framed a contract solution that delivered on those goals, and we implemented that in less than a year. So
wow.
Given the fact that our protracted process in New York, which is the same as everywhere else, typically would take anywhere from 9 to 18 months, so we were actually able to go live in that time frame.
That's awesome. In fact, you and your efforts at the City of New York were actually highlighted in an American City and County magazine article which was entitled, "If Your Customers Had a Choice, Would They Choose You?" And so you were actually recognized for your efforts there. So now I'm going to move over to something that's facing a lot of procurement teams across the nation. It's the area of emergencies. Let's just say in the olden days, you could kind of predict where emergencies were going to happen. If you're in Florida, you're probably going to get hit by a hurricane. If you're in the Midwest, tornadoes. In the West, we always have our fair share of fires. In fact, I was the purchasing agent when we had the Witch Creek fires in San Diego. But you had yourself faced a horrendous emergency. In 2012, during your tenure, you were faced with Hurricane Sandy. And for those who are listening in across the nation who are not familiar with some of the disaster numbers from that storm, 53 people were killed, and thousands of homes and over 250,000 vehicles were destroyed across New York City, its suburbs, and Long Island. The New York City subway system was flooded, and unbelievably, the New York Stock Exchange closed for 2 consecutive days. Large parts of the city and surrounding areas lost electricity for several days. Bellevue Hospital Center and several other large hospitals had to be closed and evacuated. And the economic losses across New York were estimated to be at least $18 billion due to that storm. And Sergio, you sat in that seat. So during this emergencies, were cooperative contracts part of your emergency strategy?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, we were definitely a government under stress. I mean, what people I think sometimes don't recognize is that we had Hurricane Irene just 12 months prior to that. So the city was definitely hit a couple times consecutively. Irene was somewhat of a blessing in the sense that it prepared us, or started to prepare us for the unforeseeable, which was Sandy. From a cooperative standpoint, what we had seen in Irene and knew we needed to prepare for going forward. Give you an example, the City of New York's contracts for goods and services is somewhat prescriptive and limited from a policy standpoint. Obviously, we want to debundle and spread out much of the procurement that the city does. And again, I had $2 billion under my management, but the city actually has $10 billion in negotiable spend across all of its environment. During Sandy, everything came under my guise, so it was definitely an undertaking, to say the least. What we did from a cooperative standpoint is we recognized, since many of those contracts were prescriptive, that we were going to definitely source from the MROs. We needed their supply chain in order to meet the needs of fulfilling the needs and any sort of response on the number of SKUs that they had, and the cooperatives were really going to provide us that breadth of contract and service. The other thing that we did was we really leveraged the GSA contracts, other state contracts like the state of Connecticut. Their debris removal contract was huge for us in preparation and then in execution. Ironically, going forward into Sandy, the amount of debris and vehicles, boats, you name it, that we were able to take and respond with that contract. In addition, other Jersey contracts, Florida contracts for boilers, large generators, and all sorts of other large apparatus. But I think what's important to note from a cooperative contracting standpoint and responding to emergencies is the fact that in the end, because of the fact that we had used existing and competitively bid contracts and cooperative contracts, we were then able to work very effectively with FEMA's folks, with the feds, in assuring that we would get reimbursements from the federal government for that disaster. We had no problems with the Fed as it related to that. So it's very important.
That's a great point, Sergio. That's an awesome point. I hope anybody who's listening in, if you've never been part of an emergency, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Sergio, but I just really want people to pay attention here because emergencies are all over the place now. No one section of the country is hit, and FEMA reimbursement is so important. And as with Sergio's point, they will require, even during an emergency, that contracts be bid. And when you're in the middle of an emergency, you don't have time for that. So go ahead. I'm sorry, Sergio. I just wanted to make sure people key into that about the use of co-ops during emergency and for FEMA reimbursement.
No, I'm glad that you focused on it. I'll give you just from my legal background, when you have a situation where you're employing an emergency provision in your jurisdiction, whatever that may be, that has a finite element to it. The time of the essence, the circumstances related to that emergency. So within a reasonable period of time, you need to from a federal standpoint, from a reimbursement standpoint, and so forth, you need to be procuring things competitively. And in many cases, what I've seen, unfortunately, with other jurisdictions that have either called me or whatnot asking for advice, they've moved into week 2, they've moved into several months, and are still operating under that emergency declaration, only to realize that unfortunately that procurement method at day 1 or instant 1 is not going to be applicable in the future. When you use cooperative purchasing, you don't have that issue any longer right from its onset. So that's why it was a key element of our disaster response plan.
Right, thanks for that. FEMA is really strict on that, and in the end, when your organization is trying to get that reimbursement and you can't because purchasing didn't use a competitively bid project, who's going to get blamed? It's going to be purchasing. So let's shift a little bit now. The cooperative landscape, it's expanded and grown over the last few years, in fact, quite a bit. Anytime you go to an exhibit hall of a conference, there's always new cooperatives who are there with a booth and new contracts out there. So as such, I'm starting to hear a bit of groaning because there's too many choices. It's kind of like when you go down the grocery store in the jelly aisle. There's so many types of different jellies, and not only that, just orange marmalade alone. So some entities are expressing that it would be easier just to go out to bid rather than commit the time needed to research all the various cooperative choices. But you're someone who's faced that same situation and the same number of choices. So how do you address that issue, and what is the best way, in your opinion, to approach the many choices that are available?
Well, I think the first thing is embrace the choices. I mean, I think choices are good. I don't think there's any one particular cooperative that's going to be that they're not identical. They're not identical by the way that whether it's variances as to the lead agency model as opposed to a public entity that's created for the purpose and specifically for doing cooperative purchasing, or a regional co-op or a GSA or whatnot. And I mention that because although being attorney, I'm never my jurisdiction's counsel, so I need to work with attorneys just like everybody that's on the line, and sometimes that can be difficult because of the fact that there's varying opinions as to how one particular cooperative might execute within a given jurisdiction's procurement policies, rules, and laws. So those options really present opportunities, quite frankly, to present back to the attorneys to get to yes, so that there isn't just one one structure, one model, and so forth. Again, what I've always noticed with the cooperative contracts is that there is a large breadth of services and deliverables and of options that really serve tremendously. What I've done from a technique standpoint to try to make sure that my procurement record is reflective and processing all of the due elements that you need to is really to do what I call a bake-off, and that's not my term. I think it's used by many, but I use a bake-off amongst those cooperatives that I think will bring me representative value as to the criteria that I'm looking at analyzing, and then look at things as, it's price and service and so on. I do believe that, the argument that doing a solicitation is going to be quicker, I haven't found that to be the case. I really haven't. I think when you have a cooperative that's gone through the sourcing process, it's well documented, you've dealt with the protest, you've dealt with all those elements. If you focus in on the reasonableness of price and that analysis and making the business case to your oversights, whether that oversight be a council, whether that oversight be a comptroller, whatever the case is, and then in fact with a bake-off where you have a representative sample of pricing and of deliverables, it's very difficult to argue against that. So I actually think that sometimes with some of the more sensitive or difficult procurements, cooperative purchasing is really, that process is better served, and it will save time in the end.
Right. So Sergio, while we still have the Hurricane Sandy slide up, we actually got a question from the audience, and that question was, what are some areas or vendors you can have on contract to prepare for an emergency? And I think you and I would mirror a lot of the same things, me having to handle the 2007 Witch Creek fires, but and then you Hurricane Sandy. But some of the things that comes to mind, and please jump in, MRO is a huge one. You definitely need, generators. Anything that's related to any kind of cleanup, things like that. Equipment rentals, debris removal. Water is a big thing. People don't think of that. You will lose water service and electricity. So what is affiliated with that? So ice, water, generators, refrigeration. Anything else that you can think of that people would need as far as starting to set some of those contracts on place?
Watering. Dewatering was a big issue in New York City.
Just
pumping, yeah. And the thing is that everything is a matter of scale, right? The MROs will provide you a backbone for supply chain. I sourced everything from blankets to personal heaters. Sandy hit at the tail end of October, beginning of November, so we had a situation where the weather turned on us within the first week, and then we had these areas that were decimated and started to freeze at night.
Right.
So then all of a sudden I needed to get heaters flown in, and so the MROs will provide you that type of supply chain. What you need to also identify from a contract standpoint are the larger pieces that they're not going to be able to provide you. So it's the heavy generators. We're talking about 2 kVWs. It's megawatts. Excuse me. They're just huge pieces of equipment that come on a tractor trailer, and those are going to be a different vendor set. So keeping that in mind. The other part of it that I really want to emphasize is the services. So within the city of New York, probably a gap that we didn't have that we need to scramble upon that I think will be far more proactive going forward are the engineering services, the assessment services, and then some of the back office. When we instituted the restoration centers, we had a number of them across the 5 boroughs. All of the services related to bringing up those types of restoration centers. If you're not thinking about it, and then that's what you got to do. You got to think about it, at least know what your contract path is going to be, but recognizing and doing the what-ifs, both to type of resource that you're going to need, scale, and then don't discount the types of professional and standard services that you will also need to respond to the event. Not in day 1, not in minute 30.
Right.
It's really Sandy took us the better part of well, it's still going on, but really the immediate response was the better part of 3 to 4 months.
Wow.
It's important.
So I'm going to move off of Sandy right now, but you've agreed to stay on so we can ask you some questions later in the webinar. But you have an interesting perspective in that you were the Chief Acquisition and Re-engineering Officer for a large city, but then you were also the CPO of 2 large states, New York and Michigan. So from your perspective, coming from a city versus a state, do you see any difference in the analysis or the use of cooperatives depending on the type of organization that you work for?
I think the analysis is probably the same,
Okay.
generally speaking, but I do think that the two entities are different. You know, I think cities, counties, municipalities have a different relationship with the taxpayer and you know and who we serve than the states. States tend to be more policy driven.
Right.
I think that the benefits of cooperative purchasing are the same. You're filling gaps. You're strategic sourcing with cooperatives. You know, they're a tool in the whole spectrum. I will say that on the state level, both in Michigan and New York, I think there's been sometimes there's gaps in states where a contract is expired or whatnot. And for those in the audience that are from the states, recognize cooperatives as a very, very effective tool to filling in those gaps, because the impacts to locals when those contracts expire are huge. It happened to me in the city. I remember hearing it in the state of Michigan and New York, and I was always very conscious of where our portfolio had gaps to make sure, because that if you can source you know, for the many, in a much better position as a one government sort of solution. But the second that you have a contract expiring, now you have many jurisdictions that are having to do emergency sourcing, and that's not in the best interest of anyone. So cooperative contract really is a tool, but it also is, you know, an excellent you know, gap mitigator.
Thanks. Well, thanks, Sergio, and you're going to hang on the line, but right now we're going to move to our next guest panelist. We're going to the west now, out to specifically Arizona. Wayne Casper joins us today, and as the former purchasing director for the city of Tucson, as well as the state of Arizona, and he's known as the godfather of the National Purchasing Institute's Achievement in Excellence Award. Wayne is one of the leading experts in the field of public procurement. So thanks, Wayne, for joining us to share your insights.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you, NCPP, for hosting this webinar.
Sure. So, Wayne, let's just call you and I one of the older working sets of the procurement world. So, cooperative contracting has a long history in public procurement. So, can you share how it has transformed from its early beginnings over the years to present day? What are some big differences now?
Yeah, yeah. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes. Early on, well, at least in public procurement, cooperative contracting was mostly a local effort, wherein you know, two neighboring jurisdictions might get together for a bid on a specific project. For example, I remember shortly after I began my career with the city of Tucson in 1971, as a buyer for the city of Tucson, I led a co-op effort with Tucson Unified School District for swimming pool chemicals, and it's kind of a natural. The city had about a dozen swimming pools, and the school district had but one pool. So it was kind of natural for us to take the lead, and so I issued the IFB and included the chemical requirements for TUSD. And the school district, and perhaps Tucson as well, received a lower price as a result than if we had bid separately. And of course, the TUSD also eliminated all the soft cost of issuing a bid. So this was a long time ago, but it was quite evident. Two of the major advantages of cooperative contracting were very evident very early in my career, and that is both, you know, the lower price as a result of larger quantity discounts, and the reduced or nearly eliminated cost of preparing and awarding a bid. So that example kind of stuck with me throughout my career. But so that's how cooperative. I think a lot of it across the country was like that. It was kind of a one-on-one with neighboring jurisdictions getting involved.
Right.
But by the 1980s, you began to see states beginning to extend their contracts to cities, counties, special districts, and school districts within their state. And these generically were known as state contracts.
Right.
And of course, the speed and development of this use of state contracts, including the administrative fee added by states, varied from state to state, you know, across the country. And about the same time this was going on, you began to see some development of regional cooperatives, such as the Texas Cooperative Purchasing Network and the North Central Service Cooperative in Minnesota. So that was happening at the same time as well. But probably the most significant development in the transformation of cooperative contracting has been the, at least relatively recent, growth of national cooperative organizations. And I think this was a very natural extension, if you will, of the advantages of cooperative purchasing that people saw earlier, whether it was two jurisdictions getting together or a regional cooperative. The advantages were just extended and expanded when you took that from a local or regional to a national level.
Sure, because you're driving more spend through a contract. That makes sense.
Yeah, spend gets even greater. More agencies are able to participate and piggyback off of the contracts, so the advantages just become greater. And a couple of those regional cooperatives I mentioned, such as the Texas Cooperative Purchasing Network and the North Central Services Cooperative in Minnesota, they went national. The Texas Cooperative changed its name to the Cooperative Purchasing Network, which is more likely known as TCPN, and the Minnesota North Central Services Cooperative changed their name to the National Joint Purchasing Alliance, or NJPA. So they took those regional cooperatives nationally, and then there were development of other national cooperatives such as National IPA and NPP that have grown over this time as well.
Right. So now, so many of us who have been in for a while, we see them popping up all over. And we're both seasoned professionals, but what if, moving on, if there's any new buyers in the audience, what advice would you offer to them in approaching their task and how they might be more strategic and proactive in looking at all the choices out there and just handling the daily workload and the stress of our work?
Well, obviously, one of the things that happened that led to the growth of national cooperative contracts, which certainly wasn't there when I did my first one, is the Internet. Right. And so that tool has really changed the dynamics for buyers. That tool allows you to search the cooperatives and the contracts out there. So that's really a strategic tool for buyers to use in getting additional information, finding out the best cooperative for them. So that's very, very helpful. In terms of buyers, advice I might offer in terms of buyers and their daily task, a little bit of a break from cooperative is I was very fortunate when I began to work for a purchasing director, purchasing agent, incredibly talented, and he taught me a tremendous amount, and he was my mentor. And that's not always the case for everybody. If you're in a jurisdiction, you may not have that leadership available, or it may be a relatively small jurisdiction. But again, what we have today is we have a lot of very, very strong purchasing associations, such as you mentioned the National Purchasing Institute, but also there's CAPL and FAPL and NIGP, and those associations have their conferences and chapter meetings and listservs and websites. Tremendous area to get additional information to help the new buyer. And gosh, if I could give one recommendation, it would be to get involved. There's so many changes going on in public procurement today that strategically it's not the same job you go to every day. You really need to look at where you can improve procurement, what process improvements you can make within your particular organization.
Right, right. And so we just had a question come in from the audience. When you're using a cooperative and the vendor's invoices come in, the stuff is delivered, the vendor invoices come in, and this helps lead into your next question as well, because now, in addition to your public procurement experience, you now serve as a representative from one of the cooperative contracting communities. So you have a unique perspective. You've sat on both sides of the table, and you espouse the high standards through the Achievement and Excellence Award. So coming from the cooperative side, what do you see from the cooperative community to support best practices for the procurement professionals? And also the specific question asked, if you can work that in, how do you ensure when they get the stuff delivered, the invoices come in, that they're getting the actual pricing that has been negotiated by the cooperative?
Yeah, that's I'm very, very blessed, and thanks for asking that question, Tammy. I'm very blessed in my career that after my retirement from public procurement, I've been able to continue my career in cooperative contracting, with National IPA. It's really cool, and as I've told many, many people, probably some people on this call have heard me say this before, it's neat that I get to use the knowledge and experiences gained in public procurement as kind of a bridge between suppliers and those in public procurement today. And so when I meet them, I explained that from my perspective, cooperative contracts with all the advantages really provide options for the procurement professional. And it's obviously, and I think Sergio was talking about this a little bit, not all cooperative contracts are alike, and they don't eliminate the need for a professional buyer, but they do provide a lot of advantages. And actually, cooperative contracting is one of the major changes today in public procurement. However, you need to, one key thing, Tammy, is though,
sure.
this is kind of hit me when I moved into the other side, if you will, in kind of between the suppliers and public procurement. This change is also a big change for suppliers. And a lot of people don't realize that. And just like in public procurement, some suppliers understand that paradigm shift, and some take longer to embrace the change.
Right, and I have found that with the big organizations that have, for instance, they've landed a cooperative contract, they have the pricing out there, but most of the cities and counties and even the school districts, they'll deal with a local rep, but the rep doesn't always know everything about cooperative contracting. They don't know the whole contract. So there's sometimes a little disconnect as vendors are also transitioning, because the guys in the corporate office know about it, but the people with the who are actually touching the organizations might not know all the details.
You're absolutely right. There is a learning curve for the suppliers as well. That's where actually some of the national cooperative organizations can come into play, because they do get it and they do understand it, and that's where we can help explain that. Now, I want to get back to that one question I think you had as a note in terms of the price.
Yeah, how do you ensure you're getting that? So the stuff's been delivered, you got the invoice. How do you ensure that you're getting the pricing consistently that was negotiated by the co-op?
Well, most co-op contracts are available online. So you have online the pricing, so you can self-verify it yourself. Most of the contracts also require an audit. So they're audited by a third-party audit firm to make sure that the pricing is correct. And the thing I would do initially, right from the get-go when I issue that PO, is I would clearly state on the PO that I'm using this cooperative contract, and state the cooperative contract number.
Right.
And in any discussions I have with that local rep from the supplier, I would make sure that he or she understands that I'm talking about using the cooperative contract, and that I want the pricing from that national cooperative contract, and just make it very clear that's what you're talking with. Sometimes they don't clearly understand that.
Sure. Well, Wayne, you've also promised to stay on the line, and those of you that are asking questions, I do see them, and we are going to have an opportunity at the end to get some of these questions in. There will also, for those that we don't get answered online, we will be providing all the questions and answered after this webinar. And for those of you that have asked, some of your questions have been, can we get a copy of the slides? Yes, you can. Those will be available as well. So let's move now to New Mexico. Specifically the city of Santa Fe, beautiful city. We're going to talk to the purchasing director there and board member of the New Mexico Public Procurement Association. We have Robert Rodarte to share his insights as a procurement professional. So Robert, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So the city of Santa Fe, I've been there, it's beautiful, and it serves a population of over 80,000 residents. It has a very robust tourist industry, world-renowned artist community, and frankly, visitors from all over the world come to your city. And yet, there's only a small team of only 2 procurement professionals who serve the entire organization, you and one other person. So any of those that are listening in the audience that thought we were just going to talk to the big cities like City of New York, we're going to talk to smaller procurement teams as well. So with the 2 of you in your office and a big organization to serve, how does cooperative purchasing help with your role and responsibilities in meeting all those diverse needs of your entire organization?
Scary, isn't it? 2 people. Well,
you must be Superman, Robert. You must be Superman.
Well, basically, for everyone that's out there that works in a government entity, when you only have 2 in here, things have to be done somewhere else. But the role of using the cooperative contracts out there is just immensely helped us across the board. You know, here in the city of Santa Fe, we're just a unique tourist-based organization which still has the same requirements as a big city, and we've been tasked so heavily to streamline and cut back our operations. And if you go back 3 or 4 years, you know, I had about 17 individuals that worked for me.
Wow.
And over the years, especially since about 2008, we've had to cut down. So the cooperative contracts really come into play. But to give you an idea on how they really helped us as we've been moving along throughout the years, I was tasked with cutting down our operation, and some of the major targets were the warehouses.
Right.
The warehouses consisted of, you know what it is, all the operating supplies, all that good stuff. But I shut down 3 warehouses, eliminated hundreds of thousands of dollars of inventory, and went to the use of cooperative contracts decentralized throughout the city, utilizing them to the max as far as we can go with them. But it's amazing how utilizing the just-in-time process with cooperative contracts just helped us out. And the warehouses went away, and unfortunately, you know, all these positions went away with them. And but the use of cooperative contracts stepped in and basically fulfilled that obligation that we needed.
Right. So you essentially had to decentralize a lot of your purchasing duties so that the departments had to pick up some of that workload. So your decentralized purchasing organization is actually one that mirrors that of other agencies across the country. So here's a challenge. Now that you've got decentralized purchasing, how do you manage cooperative purchasing in an organization where you have all these key customer department buyers, but you still have to maintain standards and consistencies across the entire organization? So it's a balancing. How do you handle that?
Well, the biggest issue is we're tasked here with locating as many of the standard cooperative contracts out there that's used on an everyday basis. So the key here is to find the one that best, the ones that best suit our needs, get all that information, bring it towards the governing body for approval, identify all of the best practices related to it and the uniqueness of the contracts and how it became a contract and how it's going to help the city of Santa Fe. Once the governing body has backed the suggestion you have as far as to utilize that contract, that's like half the battle. So once you've got it approved, all the existing information that you submitted to them immediately goes out to all of the entities that are going to use it. So basically we said it's citywide. And at that point, all of the department directors and all of the administrative staff have all the information that was presented to the governing body. And that's where all of the information that is on a cooperative contract, such as the method of award and everything you see that it's attached, original RFPs.
So you do all the research for them and then tell them this is available.
Right, that's the key to get it out there.
Yeah, because a lot of them aren't going to do that research. That's what purchasing normally has to do.
That's very true. And once you have it out there, they're required to follow our process. And what we do after that is we put it into our shared drives. I have a procurement shared drive in which they can go in there, and it's like a library basically. That'll give them the active contract related to that category. It's also fantastic when it comes to audits. In a small town like this, you have a lot of requests for public records, a lot of all sorts of interesting things. So we have everything's in place, and so rather than have to go out there and pull up all these items related to public records requests, you just go right in the library and you pull it right out, and it's there. You're done. And but the entire city as a whole will utilize those cooperative contracts. So it's endless, just the ones we use.
Right, right. So transparency and openness, it's a big part of your organization's mission in our profession. So did the use of cooperative purchasing assist in your efforts of that transparency?
Yes, I'll tell you, it's like I just mentioned a few minutes ago, the half of the battle is the documentation, and where every agency, regardless of what size they are always challenged by the openness of the way you procure something. There's always going to be someone out there that's going to be giving you that challenge.
Right,
But,
right.
So the ability to have all of the data that I mentioned earlier that from these cooperatives that we use, especially the method of award, the scoring, the original RFP process, the structures, all of these things, that is what they're always looking for when it comes to openness and transparency.
Right.
And so that in a nutshell, you know, is pretty much standard across the country, and we utilize it to the best of our ability.
Right. So we had a question come in. So the question was, is your office, the centralized purchasing part of the organization, are you primarily responsible for setting up the co-op contracts, or can your designated purchasing agencies or divisions or departments, however you refer to them in your city, can they go ahead and sign up? So for instance, office supplies, it might make sense, it sounds like to me, for purchasing to sign that for the entire organization. But what if, say, your fleet director wanted to go out and sign up for a co-op for tires for the fleet? Do you delegate that, or does that have to come through centralized purchasing?
Well, we need their help. I mean, it's apparent when you only have two people. So in the case of tires, for example, that's one of my areas that I take care of. But we, if they come up with cooperative contract out there or state price, something that's out there that that we can utilize, the analysis part will be done here, and we'll work closely with them to understand their wants and needs. And usually, what I'll do is utilize. They'll bring over the contract that they're looking at. We'll compare it. Then we go online here and we go see what else is out there. And, so
they can't just unilaterally go out and sign something. They still need to coordinate with purchasing.
Absolutely not. And it's it's well documented where they really can't go into negotiations and buying the city as a whole. And we do have outside agencies that are under our purview also that have that power, like the Transit Authority, aviation, water diversion, things like this. They have different bylaws, but they still come through us anyway, although they don't have to. They prefer it that way.
Okay. So when we initially talked to you about coming on board, and I loved how you expressed your openness to working with, you said you would work with multiple cooperative contracting organizations and sort of have a non-denominational approach to making those decisions. So normally when we look at cooperative contracts, of course the first thing we look at is pricing. That sort of drives that initial decision, and then the contract terms and conditions. But what other features or experiences matter to you when you're choosing one cooperative over another? Saying all things being equal, the price is the same, the terms in the contract, what would drive you toward one co-op, or what are things that you see that attracts you to using certain cooperatives over others?
Oh, well, it's the ease of the website, for one.
Okay, the website. So any cooperatives listening, check your website.
We really don't want to spend too much time on the phone calling individuals. We already know what we need. Something pops up, we're looking. And so it's just like anything else on your favorites. When you already have your favorites out there on your system, you go right to them. Right. So I have like a ranking system, and the ones that have the ease of use for me, I'll go to right away. There's some out there that, I mean, they offer me the world, and they offer me all these contracts that they feel I can use, but when I get in there, man, trying to just navigate is gets tough. We're looking for simplicity, and we're looking for standard things, like I mentioned earlier. Just the ability to go in there and pop open the contract, pop open the method of award, things like this that I know I'm going to need to fulfill all those other obligations we talked about a little earlier. And but I do utilize them all. It does not matter which organization I'm discussing something with. We have a choice out there. So their contracts are only as good as they are.
Sure. Sure. And there's a people side to that as well. It's the when you call, are they responsive when you call? Do they get information quick? At least from my memory of using co-ops, if they got to me stuff right away, if they were responsive to my emails, all those little people things count as well, not just the contract terms and conditions.
And one of the most important things is, I'm always stressing this, and several of you that are listening in today know this, but it doesn't matter what you're representing, the customer service level of when you're communicating with any entity. It's so important. We go all the way back to when I was managing a grocery store. I did that for about 21 years or whatever it was. Customer service level was one of those things that was in the forefront of it. And it hasn't changed all the going, and regardless of our technologies nowadays, it's still the same thing. It's the customer service levels that you give out. And I still believe that we haven't seen those changes, maybe from a technological standpoint or from a different way to approach how to sell a product. But you still have to have that human element. I spent many years when I ran the stores, I call it the naughty list. I'd have to I don't
know if we should go there on a webinar.
But I'd have to go to the corporate office if my customer service levels were at a certain point. If they weren't meeting the standards, you'd have to go out there and explain how you're gonna, what you're gonna do to improve it. And so I've never forgotten those things. After about 2 or 3
I mean,
times
it doesn't matter in government, in cooperatives, in the world, customer service really does make a difference and can be a differentiator as well.
I can tell the cooperatives that are listening out there, one thing I hear a lot is, sorry I didn't get back to you.
Right.
Because I'm in Dallas today, I'm in Seattle tomorrow. I have to cover the entire Southwest region, and again, customer service levels. Always remember those things when you're reaching out to your clients. Are you responding back on time? You can have the most wonderful website out there with all this information available, but if you're not responding correctly and not being able to navigate those websites, there's something wrong there.
Right. Well, thanks, Robert. So all three of our panelists have stayed on the phone, and we've had quite a few questions coming in. We will try to get some answered now, but those of you that don't get them answered on the air, we'll definitely get them out in writing. So Sergio, Hurricane Sandy really seemed to resonate with a lot of people. And Vanessa actually wrote in and she said, don't forget janitorial supplies, hand sanitizer, soap, towels, tissues, that stuff you need. But we had a couple of questions on the types of contracts during Hurricane Sandy. One person asked, did you have a contract for transportation services such as evacuations? And another asked, what about professional services like engineering and that sort of thing? How did you handle all that?
So interesting on the transportation services, we did have a contract that had put in place in advance of that for purposes of the city, but for black car drivers and that pool. And we were able to leverage that during Sandy, that's for sure. And that was structured by borough and so forth. So transportation is very, very key. The other part that we didn't get effectuated in time, but now it's in place, is any sort of ambulatory services as well. So,
we had to evacuate hospitals.
We had to evacuate hospitals, nursing homes, you name it. And in many cases, it's a much different proposition when you have folks that are not capable of moving themselves. And then having to do that in an emergency situation, or having to do that still when you had the storm surge and everything else. So yes, I think that's a very good point from the audience as far as those needs.
Right. And then Robert, we had a question about the use of co-ops and the balance between using local vendors versus, they call them the big box stores through a national co-op. Being from Santa Fe, a city that probably likes to try to keep stuff locally, how do you balance that with the co-op, using a cooperative with the local presence?
That's a great question. There's a couple of things. When you use the co-ops, the most important part when bringing it to the governing body is to let them know who's on this co-op. For example, I'm utilizing a cooperative contract right now for all of these auto parts things. Okay, whatever. There's O'Reilly's, there's whatever. All these automotive companies.
Sure.
Well, the biggest question will be asked, well, they're out of Cincinnati or whatever, and why are you utilizing a faraway company that is
Sure, headquarters are out of state.
Exactly. So basically what I'll tell them is a better example is like Home Depot and Lowell, for example. Remember, where this city is predominantly, there's no industry here, and so we rely on tourism and retail. So the key to it, although Lowell is far away, you have to come out and talk about the advantages of the co-op. One, pricing, of course, but you also have to talk about things like employment. They employ 300 and whatever amount of individuals in this city. The gross receipts taxes are generated from the big box store utilizing this, so you have to tell them that element.
How many people they employ, how many people they locally employ, that sort of thing.
Exactly, and the gross receipts taxes are vital. I can tell you that not us, but some of the smaller cities that have these larger box stores in there, that's like some of their most, 30–40% of their GRT is based on these companies. But you have to explain that kind of stuff. But you also have to go in there and when it comes to utilizing your local vendors that are not on these cooperatives, we have some independent office supply companies here. We have to give them the opportunity to compete, and so we have what they call we have a local preference here.
Sure, and a lot of cities do.
But again, they have to earn it, and so we send it out. We'll send out something utilizing the competitive process, and but they have to justify the reason behind being able to get this 10% local preference.
Okay.
But
okay. Good.
Go ahead.
So, no, that's a great answer. There's always a balancing, and we all know the risk tolerance of our own organizations. We know the politics of the time. We know our mayor and what the initiatives are. So it's always going to be a balanced game. Sometimes you can go with a co-op, and sometimes you just can't. You need to go with a local vendor for other reasons outside of price. So the name of this first webinar was Critical Analysis, and I like to sort of talk about an analogy here. Ice cream. With all the choices out there, whenever any one of us walks into our favorite ice cream store, we love to see all the choices. We love the cones, we love the flavors. However, we typically will pick the same ice cream. For me, it's vanilla with chocolate chips. That's what I want every time. However, I like having the choices. So how we relate that to cooperatives is go out there and do the research, do some of the critical analysis before you actually need to use a co-op. Find your favorite flavor. That will be your go-to co-op for most of the things. But go and get your Rocky Road and your mint ice cream, because you're going to need some backup co-ops as well. Talk to your attorneys, get it pre-approved. If you have to go before your city council or board, get them to approve the use as well. It's starting to line up and do the critical analysis before you actually need it. So we appreciate you being part of this webinar series today. As purchasing professionals, what we do makes a huge difference for our organizations and the communities whom we serve. Thanks for joining the webinar today. All attendees will be receiving a survey, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. In addition, a certificate for 1 hour of continuing education credit will be emailed to you within the next day. We do have 2 more webinars coming up with other panelists that will be joining us in July and August. If you haven't already signed up for those, we hope you will. This is Tammy Rhymes. I wish you the best as you go forth and procure. Thank you.